So welcome all to the second panel on global history organized by Tokyo College. And as Haneda Sensei explained to us just now in Japanese, this is more of kind of one of the kind of possible application of global history. And today we were talking about the theme of identity. So first speaker is actually Haneda Sensei, and probably he doesn't need any more introduction, but I'll just briefly talk about his far and wide interests of he has and he achieved. Professor Haneda Masashi is currently the director of Tokyo College, Tokyo University, and he was formerly a professor at the Institute for Advanced Studies on Asia, we call Tobunken or Toyo Bunka Kenkyujo in this university. So I'm also associate professor of Toyo Bunka Kenkyujo as well. So he was my senior colleague. And his main topics of research are global and world history. Global and world history of the East Asian maritime world and Islamic urban studies and Iranian history of the 16th to 18th centuries and studies of European travel accounts on Persia and so on. And his current topic of research is on finding a new way of describing world or global history. And today's, I think, one of the talk is his new interest.
Okay, thank you very much. I switched language from Japanese into English. So as a first speaker, I would like to propose some questions for further research of this Global History Collaborative. And let me start by an interesting experience and a very good conversation with one of my Mexican colleagues. I have prepared bilingual power slides. That means PowerPoint slides. That means this side Japanese translated from English, and English translated from Japanese. So for Japanese audience, please follow the right-hand side. Very good conversation with one of my Mexican colleagues at El Colegio de Mexico, which is one of the most distinguished, prestigious research institution in Mexico last year. When I arrived at Mexico City, I was astonished at the variety of people living there. Of course, the Spanish language is very influential, but they have more than 62 or at least 60 local languages, and their physical outlook is very, very various. And what was amazing for me is that the difference rather than the similitude is stressed very much in the display of local cultures in National Museum of Ethnology in Mexico City. So at that museum, they stress that there are many differences in Mexican local cultures rather than similitude. So I wanted to know what is the national identity of Mexican people, and I asked to the president of that prestigious institution, who is in the middle of that small picture, a lady, what is your national identity? And she responded me, being diverse. This answer surprised me very much, because until then, I had a thought that something homogeneous is an important element of national identity. And furthermore, if Mexican identity is being diverse, what's the difference between Mexican national identity and American national identity, or Canadian national identity, or even French or UK national identity? They all claim all claim their society is very diverse. Can we regard it as their own national identity? Or the meaning of, maybe at that moment, I suppose that the meaning of identity in Japanese may be different from that in English, as is often the case. So I wrote to my experience to my Global History Collaborative members to ask their opinions. Mark Ely, who spoke last time at this panel, responded to me like this. His answer is very interesting and very inspiring. Please read this. I don't read these sentences, but anyway, what is important is nowadays, in many countries, being diverse is a very important value. And there is no distinction in this respect. And how diversity, they define diversity would be interesting to compare. That is a very interesting question. And but at the same time, he said, what would be the answer in China or Spain? In China or Spain, do they believe that their society or their national identity is very big, being diverse or something like that? Mark Ely is right in a sense that even in Japan, not only politicians, but also intellectual people, many intellectuals always underline the diversity of Japanese society. Japanese society is very diverse. We have to make the Japanese society more diverse. That is a kind of statement by many people. But at the same time, they often stress the importance of Japaneseness or Japanese characteristics, which is also called Japanese national identity. And they differentiate Japanese people from other people. Now, I am at a loss. And what is the concept of national identity in the world nowadays? If we allow to be diverse as national identity, Japan's case is very exceptional. Is it like this, or it is just a question of the difference of meaning in various languages? Are we losing our national characteristics, particularity, etc.? I don't know quite well. So I try to make a research on the meaning of identity at first in English. This is the explanation by Oxford English Dictionary. And in this case, on the meaning of identity, the next speaker, Professor Sylvia Sebastiani, will explain you more from the viewpoint of European researcher. But this is a very brief explanation. Even in the 18th century, we have already this kind of meaning of identity. And in 19th century, so this is just in English. I'm very sorry, but I forgot to translate all these sentences into Japanese. But in the 19th century already, just like the first sentence, he doubted his own identity and whether he was himself or another man. I now translate it into Japanese. 彼は自分自身のアイデンティティを疑った。彼自身なのか、それとも他の人なのかと。In this respect, there is no strange feeling. This sentence, we can use identity like this even now. And at the beginning of the 20th century, we have already the term of national identity in the second sentence. And let's get some information from other language than English. In case of French, the term is written like this and pronounced identité. And I forgot to translate all these French terms into English, but maybe English speaker can understand all these sentences very well. And anyway, at the beginning of the 19th century, maybe they had already the same meaning of identity as now. And at the beginning of the 20th century, pièce d'identité, carte d'identité, which we still use in French society, even 証明書, already appeared. So it means that before, already in the 19th and 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, people started to use the term identity. But at the same time, I have to say that the introduction of the concept into the academic world is rather late. It was Erickson's work which used the term of identity for the first time in academic world. It was around 1950s, and with the book published in 1968, the term identity became very popular among academic people, and it has been diffused to other disciplines. And in case of historical studies, maybe the book written by Fernand Braudel, L'identité de la France, Identity of the France, published in 1986, is one of the early examples of historical studies on identity. And then after that started, 5 minutes already. After that, so all these books. Then what I want to stress is that even if we have already a very good example of research, interdisciplinary research, like Amin Maalouf and Amartya Sen's books, the world has been changing very much since then. And in addition, I have some doubt about the way they are discussing identity, because in their book, the identity is regarded as universal. In everywhere in the world, people use the same concept of identity, and I am not in favor of this kind of idea. So I think it is time for us to reassess the concept of identity and the questions related to it. I'm particularly interested in, so these are the questions I am now posing to my colleagues. I have no time to read all these, but all these questions are very interesting to discuss among historians. And particularly, I am quite interested in the last one. Are there any impalpable and delicate differences of meaning of the term in various languages in the world? Because even if we use the term, that's the same concept, identity, maybe between Japanese and English, or between Japanese and Spanish, there may be some kind of slight difference of the concept. That is the point I want to stress. And to show one example, I would like to introduce you the introduction of the term identity into Japanese very briefly. I know that this is a very preliminary research, and I need to examine a lot. But for the moment, I will show you just an example. It was in 1968 that Asahi Shimbun, which is a very famous Japanese newspaper, quality newspaper, used for the first time the term identity with the term identity crisis, with the name of Erickson. So just after the publishment of that book by Erickson, it was introduced into Japanese. But at that moment, there was no term which corresponds with the term concept of identity. So they were obliged to translate the term into Japanese character and call that identity in Japanese as well. But in the 90s, that term appeared sporadically, but certainly in connection with identity crisis. And in the 1980s, it appeared quite often because of the usage of Prime Minister Nakasone Yasuhiro's of this term. He always used the term Japan's identity. And of course, the newspaper introduced all these, or presented all these statements or discussions on paper. And at that moment, but there was no exact term which correspond with identity in Japanese. So a transliterated term identity plus one Japanese word appeared on journal. First one, 主体性、固有性、自己認識. All these terms were there to explain the meaning of identity. But anyway, what is certain is that the concept of identity was very closely linked with the concept of nation from the beginning in case of the Japanese language, apart from identity crisis. And the last slide for further discussion. So I am quite interested in examining in detail the history or evolution of the usage of identity in Japanese. First, that is my research topic. And I want my colleagues to do the same thing in case of other languages than Japanese. In case of English, maybe my partner can tell later. Professor Nord will tell certainly some part of this question, answer of this question later. And finally, national, local, imperial identity versus globalism. This is a very important conceptual framework we are now tackling in this contemporary world. And we need to discuss this as well. And I'm sure that there are many other issues to discuss among historians of global history collaborative, and I am looking forward to waiting all these comments and suggestions by our colleagues and audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the wonderful opening talk. So we will move to a second presentation by Professor Sylvia Sebastiani. She's a professor at École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, UHESS, Paris, France. And she's a specialist in the Scottish Enlightenment. And Professor Sebastiani is currently developing a project on the boundary of humanities, and her research focuses on entangled networks of animals, slaves, and material goods in the 18th century, which sounds very exciting. And her publication includes The Scottish Enlightenment, Race, Gender, and the Limit of Progress. Personally, I'm really excited by Professor Sebastiani's talk because I lived in Edinburgh, which is the capital of Scottish Enlightenment, for many years, and I myself feel like I'm a more Scottish Japanese or Japanese Scottish. So it's really excited to hear Professor Sebastiani's presentation. So her talk is Enlightenment and the Problem of Identity, a Scottish Contribution.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you to having invited me here. In the 50 minutes that I have at my disposal, I'll deal with the question of identity by focusing on a specific chronology and approach. I'll focus on the new universal and philosophical histories written by Enlightenment philosophers. So we immediately go back on time and I'll center my speech in the second half of the 18th century and in Scotland. The first point to be stressed is that in the 18th century, identity was not the word that philosophers would have used in order to speak about the distinctiveness or singularity of society. According to Samuel Johnson Dictionary of the English Language, which is one of the most useful tools for reflecting about English terminology in the 1750s, identity meant quite the opposite, that is, sameness, not diversity, from the Latin idem, which means the same. It is thus the contrary of diversity, defined by the same source as, I quote, difference, dissimilitude, unlikeness, variety, distinct being, not identity, variegation. So it is almost the opposite of the modern sense of the word that Professor Aneda has defined in introducing the introduction of the topic. And I think this is an important issue as a historian to underline. The expression that was commonly used in the 18th century political, philosophical, and historical discourse for distinguishing people was national characters, which is the combination of nation plus characters. Both these terms had multiple and stable meanings in the 18th century. Character, from its Greek etymology, meant impression, graving, coining, a mark, a stamp, in Johnson's definition. When applied to humankind, it denotes a particular constitution of the mind, a certain propensity of the soul, more commonly found in certain nations than in others. As the article Caractère des Nations of the Encyclopédie, written by D'Alembert, states. Nation meant, first of all, lineage, extraction, and stock. Its Latin etymology is natio, that is, to be born, belonging together by birth, or place of birth. Following again Johnson's definition, a nation is a, quote, a people distinguished from another people, generally by their language, original, or government. A nation properly signifies a great number of families derived from the same blood, born in the same country, and living under the same government and civil constitution. The idea that nations possess unique characteristics which distinguish them from any other stretches back to the Hippocratic medicine of humors. But it was in the 18th century that the meaning of nation started to change. In the second half of the 18th century, nation gradually becomes a historical and cultural category associated with the heritage of social customs and beliefs, linked to political units. It is then that nation acquired the linguistic and cultural sense of imagined communities as labeled by Benedict Anderson's authoritative work. Modern historiography has often stressed that universalism is, a quote from Jonathan Israel, one of the quintessential characteristics of the Enlightenment. This might be true, but it's only part of the story. The other side of the same discourse is that Enlightenment historiography also paid attention to diverse national paths. It is precisely the universal scope of their histories that prompt philosophers to examine humanity in its multiple expressions. I'll try to show this point by focusing on Enlightenment history writings, which has been considered by the great scholar of historiography Arnaldo Momigliano as the origins of modern European historiography. My claim is that nations and national characters are central topics in Enlightenment historiography. What I argue is that the Enlightenment is characterized by an unresolved tension between uniformity and diversity, regularity and singularity. I suggest that such a tension is constitutive of the Enlightenment itself, and it is a major as well as problematic legacy to the Enlightenment that the Enlightenment left to our modern societies, or at least Western culture. I'm very interested in discussing with you here if something similar also happens in Japan or otherwise. The British case is interesting here, as Britain experienced an impressive growth and circulation of information all along the 18th century, an argument made by our colleague from Princeton, Linda Colley. It went through a successful process of nation-state formation as a composite state and empire building through radical changes in its administrative, fiscal, and military structures, as John Brewer has shown in a wonderful book which has also been translated into Japanese, which is The Sinews of Power. I'll focus now on one of the parts of the British composite state, which is Scotland, and on the specific movement known under the name of the Scottish Enlightenment. In 1707, the Treaty of Union established that the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland, which at the time were separate states with separate legislature and parliaments, but with the same monarch, were united into one kingdom by the name of Great Britain. And this is the article of the first treaty, the first article of the treaty. Within this new configuration, the position of Scotland is a peculiar one. Scotland was at the same time at the periphery of Britain and at the heart of British Empire, then under construction. All along the 18th century, Scottish intellectuals shared the same concern: how to transform poor Scotland into a prosperous, educated, and culturally unified country, following the Dutch and English models. Economically divided, Scotland was also socially and culturally divided between the feudal highlands and structured in clans and of Gaelic language, and the lowlands, more urban, with 4 university cities, several publishers, and many clubs and libraries. See, for instance, in the slides, the distribution of libraries. The black mark is the line of division between highlands and lowlands, and you can see very clearly that everything is concentrated in the lowlands. As she said, it's in Edinburgh especially. This explains perhaps why the reflection on progress and on identity and distinctiveness was so important in 18th century Scotland. David Hume, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, William Robertson, Lord Keynes, Thomas Reid, and John Millar, among many others, devoted their philosophical and economic inquiries into the principles of human nature as means to investigate the material, moral, and institutional causes of social development. At the core of their preoccupation was the long course of development of human societies. In the philosophical history of the Scottish literati, nations became the products of civilization, that is a historical product. You possibly know Adam Smith as the author of The Wealth of Nations, but he was, first of all, a professor of jurisprudence and of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow. In his lectures on jurisprudence in the 1750s, Smith formulated an idea of human progress, which became a common framework for the Scottish Enlightenment. It allowed the evolution of humankind from savagery. I'm using, of course, the language of the 18th century. It's not myself that speaks about savagery, but Adam Smith, towards civil society through successive stages of socio-economic development. First, the age of hunters. Secondly, the age of shepherds. Thirdly, the age of agriculture. And fourthly, the age of commerce. According to this scheme, humankind evolved by degrees from the simple, rough, and lawless life of savages. Hunters' society corresponded to savages, according to 18th century language, to complex, polite, and commercial societies. Rather than examining heroes, kings, and political events, which were the core of traditional history up until then, Adam Smith and other Scottish historians focused on manners, customs, and sentiments. They dismissed chronology and privileged a comparative perspective. They sketched a history of civil society encapsulated by the neologism civilization, which became a key concept in France as well as in Scotland by the 1770s, with the meaning the process of civilizing oneself. This involved every aspect of human life. As modes of subsistence improved, so too did material conditions. The number and complexity of laws increased, and there was a growing refinement in the habits and manners of peoples, together with their thoughts and sentiments. The uniformity of the savage stage, where everyone engaged in the same activities as hunters and warriors, gave way to a growing division of labor that contributed to diversify the organization of societies as well as personality. Within this view, diversity and singularity were the product of history. This is an important point for the question at stake. In a few remaining minutes, I'm going, she told me 5, I'm going to concentrate on 2 major figures of the Scottish Enlightenment who both dealt with the question of how civilization impacted the diversification of characters. William Robertson principal of the University of Edinburgh, King's historiographer, and leader of the Church of Scotland, was the author of 4 main histories, moving out from Scotland, the history of Scotland, then the history of Europe, then the history of America, and then the history of India. So providing a sweeping narrative of the rise of the Western European nation states toward global domination. The other is Adam Ferguson, professor of natural history for 5 years, and then professor of moral philosophy for over 20 years at the University of Edinburgh. Like the other Scottish literati, Robertson reaffirms the regularity of a universal progress based on the materialistic assumption that, I quote, the disposition and manner of men are formed by their situation and arise from the state of society in which they live. You will see that this is a very materialistic statement. The moment that begins to vary, the character of a people must change. In every part of the earth, the progress of man has been nearly the same, and we can trace him in his career from the rude simplicity of savage life until the elegance of polished societies. So this means that diversity is historically and socially constructed. Robertson claimed that savagery is principally characterized by uniform and similar manners, customs, and behavior. For him, all Americans from Canada to Cape Horn were savages, and it would be highly improper to describe the condition of each petty community. And I quote again, the qualities belonging to the people of all the different tribes have such a near resemblance that they may be painted with the same features. The method has to change when the object of study is the history of Europe, and the historian does not deal anymore with the static condition of savagery, but with dynamism, singularity, and variety. At the core of a view of the progress of societies in Europe, which introduced the history of the reign of Emperor Charles V, Robertson traces the main steps through which European societies progressed, from the fall of the Roman Empire through the age of Charles V, which corresponded to the beginning of modern world. And here the quotation, please pay attention to the bold words. We can trace a succession of causes and events which contributed, some with a nearer and more conspicuous, other with a more remote and less perceptible influence, to abolish confusion and barbarism, and to introduce order, singularity, and refinement. In his careful use of rhetorics, Robertson emphasizes an asymmetry with the past, which is worth noting. Whereas order is opposed to confusion and refinement counters barbarism, a third factor emerges, which does not find any correspondence in ancient times, that is singularity. Singularity comes out of history. It is the product of history. It is thus the specific characteristics of modernity, a dynamic element that is set against the uniformity of savagery. What has to be understood then is in which kinds of societies achieve civilization, which societies are able to distinguish themselves, and how and when peoples express their peculiar character. The historical concept of nation emerges within the context of the search for individuality. The historian of Europe, in contrast to the historian of America, has therefore to look for those causes that render European nations singular and unique within their common path towards civilization. So his strong idea is that commerce and globalization united people who had been divided by history. I would like to conclude, and this is my last point, this reflection on a question raised by Adam Ferguson in his essays on the history of civil society. So I just conclude this. I just make a point of Ferguson. Ferguson's work is a very, very complex one, but I just make a point. Ferguson expressed a fear that today is shared by many people in front of globalization, as well as global history, the fear to lose national specificities. For him, the danger was that globalization and commerce, by bringing peoples into close contact and dissolving animosity and conflict, a process that Robertson as well as Smith saw as a positive feature of modernity, would erase particularity. Ferguson feared that the excessive diffusion of commerce and globalization, the multiplication between peoples, would eliminate rivalry among nations and thus weaken social bonds at home. in his essay on the history of civil societies, it seems to repeat the theme that within the historical progress, societies differentiate and acquire a variety of characters. I'm not going to read the quotation, but the first part is exactly the same of what Robertson says. So people among savages are uniform and they distinguish with society. But then he adds the second part of the quotation that I don't read, but I comment simply. For him, the process of civilization and modernization create new uniformities. This means that commercial globalization destroys national variation and renders peoples uniform again, as they were in the savage state. This is just to stress that some of the 18th century fears live still today with us. And possibly one of the Enlightenment legacy is precisely an unresolved tension between universalism and particularism, what unite and what distinguish us.
Thank you very much, Professor Sebastiani. So next speaker, let me introduce, is a Professor Philip Nord from the University of Princeton. Professor Philip Nord studies the political and cultural history of modern France. Professor Nord's first book, Paris Shopkeepers and the Politics of Resentment, which was published in 1986, follows the birth and political evolution of an influential small business protest movement in the late 19th century Paris. And Professor Nord has a long list of publications, but I just limit myself to the latest one, which is France 1940, The Defining the Republic, which is his latest book. Okay, please, Professor.
Thank you for that generous introduction. Thank you all also for coming, and a special thanks, multiple thanks, as I'll explain in a moment, to Professor Haneda for giving me this opportunity to speak to you, and also for his gracious hospitality these last few days. I have another reason to thank him, because his introductory remarks will shape my own. He mentioned two authors in particular, Erik Erikson, with whom I'll begin, who is the author, as Professor Haneda indicated to you, of a book, Identity, Youth, and Crisis, published in 1968, which helped to popularize the notion of an identity crisis. Erikson was a psychiatrist. The term identity crisis is meant to be a psychiatric term. He understood human development as passing through stages, beginning in childhood, not just ending in adulthood, but lasting all the way through death. But there was a crucial hinge moment in youthful years, hence the youth in the title, when individuals experienced an identity crisis. Given the date of this book's publication in 1968, you can imagine how rapidly it was appropriated to express not just an individual identity crisis, but the group identity crisis of a post-war generation, the baby boomers. Now, this book was published in 1968. Brodel's text, The Identity of France, L'Identité de la France, came out in 1986. A much different moment, a moment one of my colleagues has characterized as the age of fracture, a sense that the world has come apart, is fragmenting, and it's in response to this world that Brodel writes. You know him as an historian of the longue durée, of things that develop so slowly that amidst the din and noise of event history, you cannot detect the changes. Historians can do that, but normal mortals are unable to do so. It might have looked like a solid French identity was evaporating in the 1980s, but Brodel wrote to suggest that in fact there was a bedrock of permanence to French identity, which had been formed over centuries, formed by geography, patterns of settlement, demography, and the like. So don't get too anxious. It looks like identity is falling apart, but it isn't really. So one more book I want to mention in this connection. wonder if they're known to you, all these texts, but some of them were quite popular and remain so. Pierre Nora's Les lieux de mémoire, La République, which was published in 1984, which is translated into English as Realms of Memory, the Republic. I don't know if it's a mistranslation. I would have said spaces of memory or places of memory, but that's neither here nor there. And he was responding to the crisis as well, not using Annales-style history in order to construct a permanent identity, but using a new kind of history, the history of memory, to imagine what constituted the Republic and how the Republican idea had been built up over centuries since the French Revolution. Once again, a historian responding to a particular moment, using his tools, inventing tools in this particular case, in order to come to grips with what he was experiencing as a crisis. Well, this is a bibliographical excursus that may be of small interest to you, but I hope it suggests three things. One is that you see some slippage in the word of identity and its usage from the individual and psychiatric analysis into a term of collective historical analysis. And it's worth pondering, I won't do it for you because I don't have the time, what's gained and lost by that kind of maneuver, which people do subtly and unaware very often. Second point is that history writing is very much implicated in this process of the emergence of identity, either using old tools, imaginative, creative tools, as in the case of Brodel, a founder of the Annales School, or else inventing something new altogether. Memory studies. I'm not saying that Nora is the founder of memory studies, but he is a pioneer in the field. And the third point I would draw from my beginning is that it's in moments of crisis, or in a moment of crisis, the 1970s and 1980s, that the idea of identity began to gain purchase. As you can see, it's existed for centuries, but to use it the way we use it now, to study crisis, identity formation, and to use it as a tool of historical analysis and public politics, is something I think, well, I'm sure someone will disagree, relatively new. It probably happened in medieval times. Somebody will tell me this. Certainly early modern. But in any case, I'm making a pitch for the period of the 1970s. And I want to take a closer look at the 1970s to think a little bit more about why this was such a critical decade. But before I do, I'm going to back up to the end of World War II. Does this make sense? Well, it's at that moment, and as a consequence of the war, that what I will call certain memory regimes crystallize, having to do with the meaning of the war and what its significance was. I'll be very impressionistic and stereotyping brutally, so please forgive me. But it was the Great Patriotic War for the Soviet Union. It was the Good War for the United States. These are people's opinions. But I don't want to suggest that these regimes of memory were without fissures or were Unitarian in nature. In France, which is a country that I know a little bit about, the fractures are very, very evident between Gaullists on the one hand, who understand the war as the struggle of the patriotic people against an inherited enemy, Germany in this case. A patriotic effort led by the general himself. The Communist Party has a different understanding of what the war signified. It was a great anti-fascist struggle. And I would say one more thing about this: these regimes of memory. They are anchored in institutions, anchored by states, which attempt to either inculcate them in people or enforce them as a way of thinking. And they are also amplified by the media at the same time. And they survive in part because they are useful in the Cold War that will follow. In the 1940s and 1950s, America had fought Nazism, and it continued to fight totalitarianism into the 1950s. The Soviet Union had fought fascism, and it will fight fascism's heirs in the 1950s, the heirs being West Germany, the United States, NATO, while we're at it. Well, this world of memory, or these regimes of memory, will begin to fall apart in the 1970s without ever disappearing, and we live with vestiges of them, and there are people who will still fight for these points of view, but their, I don't want to say hegemonic position, their upper hand will be challenged. And since I made an allusion to 1968, a little bit earlier is the date of Erickson's publication, I'm going to start with the baby boomers and citing you one more text by another Frenchman. Forgive me for this. Some of you won't require apology from me, and that is Le Syndrome de Vichy, the Vichy Syndrome by Henri Rousseau. He uses the metaphor of a broken mirror to describe what young people did in not literally 1968, but in the 60s and on into the 70s. They broke the mirror of their parents' stories, of their elders' understandings of the war. What did you do in the war, Daddy? Were you a résistant? Or were you a Vichy supporter? That may be a reference a little remote, but just the same, questioning their parents, challenging their stories, and not just challenge them inside the family, but challenge them out in the streets using a very particular set of tactics, demonstrations, sit-ins, and the like, much of it couched in Marxism language. All right. So, baby boomers first. Second of all, the economic crunch of the 1970s. I was about to use the word globalization, but I'm chickening out. I'm not going to do it. But emblematized by the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979, and it was a transformative moment for both right and left. Oh goodness. So, brutal, and not just transformative for the left in particular, for the left had for so long, whether it's New Deal progressives, socialists, social democrats, communists, had pinned their hopes on labor as the future of the world. And in the 1970s, in the industrial core of Europe and the United States, industrial laborers as a percentage of the population begins to shrink, and it will continue to shrink. Coal miners will disappear as a profession in many parts of the Western world, and trade unionism will also weaken at the same time. And this has its effect on how history is practiced. When I began in the 1970s, social history was the history that people did, and labor history was the queen of all the subjects. How did the working class come to consciousness? I won't go into the details. Is this question posed by historians much anymore? I'm sure somebody does it. Things don't disappear from the face of the earth, but it doesn't occupy the position that it once did. Well, the right too will be transformed by this crunch of the 1870s, because an old model of industrial capitalism enters into retreat, but there are new opportunities to make money in the world, in high tech, in finance, in the energy sector. Maybe I'm too American-centric, but you can see that in my remarks. The problem is to rid the economy of the shackles of New Deal regulation and let the market work its magic. And that has bequeathed to us what I was about to call neoliberal enthusiasms, but I'm now going to change that. Free enterprise enthusiasm with which we still live in the world today. The capstone of these developments was the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and the decline of world communism, a truly massive phenomenon. Third piece of the puzzle, and I will begin to move more rapidly, has to do with decolonization and its aftermath. was a Janus-faced phenomenon. The mid-70s, in my view, are a crucial moment in this process. Just cite two events. Of course, the end of the war in Vietnam, the defeat of the United States, and ultimately the collapse of the Republic of South Vietnam. And also, perhaps something not always remarked on, but still important, the end of the Portuguese Empire in the mid-1970s. The imperial age, in a certain respect, ends in the mid-1970s. Many hopes by many people and in the academic world were pinned on national liberation movements, and now new independent states are proliferating as never before, earlier than the 70s, 1960s and 1950s as well. But it was a moment of promise and aspiration, but I also want to suggest in the mid-1970s a moment of disappointment and self-criticism. And I'll cite three things in this connection. One having to do with Cambodia and the genocide in Cambodia. The second with the Vietnamese boat people. These are all late 70s events. And the third one, which played a role in the United States, so that's why I mentioned the Mariel boat lift, the departure of several thousand Cubans from the port of Mariel in Cuba. So, can you pin your hopes or shape your identity around aspirations for national liberation, third world revolution, or whatever? So now let me return in the 2 minutes that remain to me. I probably don't have 2 minutes, but. So the decade of the 1970s blew apart post-war regimes of memory, creating what our colleague Dan Rogers has called the age of fracture. Familiar identities were eroded. National stories of a heroic nature, whether it's America the Good or the Soviet Union as the vanguard of the proletariat, that was wiped off the map altogether. Class identities, once so important, were up for grabs. And third world revolution was no longer the lodestar, not that it ever was for many people, but for those for whom it did count, that it once was. So this is a moment of identity crisis, in a manner of speaking, which cracks something wide open. It clears the decks, cracks something open, and it's into this world that the study of identity emerged. Ethnic identities, gender identities, national identity, racial identity, sexual identity, multiplying, and also some people thinking about the nation itself as a diverse phenomenon, which is where Professor Haneda began. I also want to suggest, because it's my nature to see the dark side of things at the same time, is that more than one can play at the game of identity. Yes, let's reinvent the nation. Rediscover the Republic, as did Pierre Nora. Oh, that sounds attractive. Frenchness and peasant traditions, as did Brodel. Okay. But there are more conservative variants. Let's freeze in place a national narrative, a récit national, and return to that. Forget everything that the baby boomers did. Forget all the mirror breaking that happened in the 60s and 70s, and try to get back to the good old story. There are darker versions of this. There are racist appropriations that are possible. In other words, to place on the nation itself a racial reading, and this lies behind the kind of white identitarianism which is so rampant. I don't know if it's so rampant, which is more rampant in the United States today than it was, well, when I was young in the 50s, it was there too. Well, all right, I take it with a grain of salt. It's back in the public domain. But I wouldn't want to stop there because there's one more form of national identity that is now perhaps the most potent of them all in the world, in which people tend not to discuss, academics that may be, and that's religious nationalism. So let's start with any religion that comes to mind. I'll start with Christianity. America, of course, is a Christian nation. I'll do a Catholic version of this. Poland is a Catholic nation. Hungary is a Catholic nation. Russia is a Russian Orthodox nation. India is a Hindu nation. Israel is a Jewish nation. Pakistan is an Islamic nation. Saudi Arabia is an Islamic nation. Iran, of course, is an Islamic republic. So what I want to suggest to you is that the world that we now live in was one whose beginnings can be traced to the 1970s, when an older way of organizing the meaning of public life began to give way under the pressures that I've described for you, creating a space for something new, for identity studies, not just as a subject of academic life, but identity also is something that shapes public discourse. And it shapes it, I would put it, depends on your politics. And I guess that's the point. For better or worse, it's something full of promise for some and full of menace for others. The only thing I would say is that this genie has been let out of the bottle and can't be put back in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nord. So last speaker we have today is Professor Andreas ECKERT. Professor ECKERT is Professor of African History at Humboldt University, Berlin, Germany. Since 2009, he's also Director of the International Research Center called Work and Human Life Course in Global History, funded by the German Federal Ministry for Education and Research. He widely published on 19th and 20th century African history, colonialism, labor, and global history, and served for many years as editor of the Journal of African History. Professor ECKERT also regularly publishes for German newspapers. And here I stumble because my friend, I can manage French, but I can't really manage German. It's called Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, something like that. And Die Zeit, Die Zeit. Don't know. Most recent books, Global Histories of Work, 2016, and Global History of Labor in Africa, 20th and 21st centuries. He's also about to complete a short history of colonialism to be published by Princeton University Press.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. So our little tour de force ends in Africa. But before I provide some very brief examples on the issues of identity in Africa, let me start with two general remarks. The first is that there is among scholars a widespread conviction, which has been most recently expressed again by Kwame Anthony Appiah, the star philosopher of Ghanaian British descent, teaching at NYU, formerly Princeton, who emphasized that the supposedly eternal categories people used to group themselves into antagonistic collectives are misleading memes of recent vintage. Appiah argues that although people seem to have an innate clannishness, as he calls it, that is an instinct to identify with groups, the common essential properties that bind those groups are arbitrary, inconsistent, and mainly imaginary. Still, one of the problems we face is that while scholars happily deconstruct identities, people believe in them and act accordingly. And that leads me to a second, more conceptual issue, which has been most forcefully brought forward by Rogers Brubaker and Frederick Cooper, a sociologist and an historian, in a by now rather famous essay, Beyond Identity. And in this essay, they again underline that identity is one among many key concepts or key terms in social science and history that is at once a category of practice and a category of social, political, and historical analysis. And as a category of practice, it is used by what we could call lay actors in a number of everyday settings to make sense of themselves, of their activities, of what they share with, and how they differ from others. And it is also used by political entrepreneurs to persuade people to understand themselves, their interests, and their predicaments in certain ways. That is, to persuade certain people that they are, for certain purposes, identical with one another, and at the same time different from others. And to organize and justify collective action along certain lines. And one problem, this is a point the two authors make, and I think something we have to think about, one problem to use a term like identity as an analytical category lies in the danger of unintentionally reproducing or reinforcing reifications of identities which are part of the politics of identity. So often identity is used analytically a good deal of the time, more or less, as it is used in practice, in an implicitly or even explicitly reifying manner, in a manner that implies that identities exist and that people have an identity, so to speak. So often we see an amalgam of constructivist language and essentialist argumentation. And this reflects not the least the dual orientation of many academics as both analysts and protagonists of identity politics. And it also reflects the tension between the constructivist language that is required by academic correctness and the foundationalist or essentialist message that is required if appeals to identity are to be effective in practice. I think this kind of tension is something we have to deal, and the examples I give, especially the first one, will show that hopefully. So I will talk about Africa, and the fact that I dare to talk within less than 50 minutes about Africa is also reifying a kind of essentialist thinking about this continent. Even George W. Bush knew that Africa is a big country, so I will make just I will provide two examples of different kind of stories of identity in recent years. But the starting point is that there is still very much essential thinking about Africa as a continent in which most Africans still relate to bounded tribal identities going back to the pre-colonial period before the mid-19th century. So ethnicity or ethnic identities are still often treated as a kind of cultural ghost, an atavistic residue deriving from the distant past of rural Africa that should have evaporated with the passage of time, but somehow continues to refuse to obey laws of social and political change. So ethnic consciousness or ethnic identities or tribal identities in this view are a form or seen as a form of collective irrationality that can lead to massive violence and death. And no more recent event seemed to have proved this assumption more than the genocide in Rwanda. On April 6, 1994, what the international press described as a tribal bloodbath began in Kigali, the capital of Rwanda in Central Africa. And this bloodbath started when the plane carrying the country's president, Juvenal Habyarimana, returning from peace discussions in Arusha in Tanzania, and when this plane was shut down. The government of Rwanda at the time was dominated by people who called themselves Hutu, which most of the press assumed was a tribe that had long been engaged in rivalry and eventually civil war with another tribe known as Tutsi. Indeed, a significant number of Tutsi had fled from periodic massacres over the previous decades, and a group of exiles was invading Rwanda from neighboring Uganda to fight for a place for Tutsi in Rwandan government and society. The peace discussions in Arusha were an attempt to solve the conflict. But on the night the plane crashed, there began mass killings of Tutsi that within a few days became a systematic slaughter conducted by the Hutu-dominated army, by local militias, and apparently by an angry mob. The killing spread throughout Rwanda, and it soon became clear that it was more than a spontaneous outburst of hatred. It was a planned attempt to destroy the entire Tutsi population from babies to elders. When it ended a few months later, around 800,000 Tutsi had died. There was a large part of the Tutsi population, as had numerous Hutu who had opposed the genocidal leaders. And the massacre or the genocide only ended because the Hutu-dominated army, deeply involved in the genocide, proved unable to fend off the invading forces which captured Kigali and moved to take control over the rest of the country. So many observers, and not only journalists, but also politicians at the time, interpreted the Rwandan genocide as a descent into tribal violence. However, the murderous violence that erupted on April 6, 1994, was not a spontaneous outburst of ancient hatred. It was prepared by a modern institution, a government which is in a bureaucratic and military apparatus, using modern means of communication and modern forms of propaganda. The hatred in Rwanda was real enough, but it was a hatred with a history, not a natural attribute of cultural difference and the result of hardened ethnic identities. Indeed, cultural difference in Rwanda was relatively small. Hutu and Tutsi speak the same language, most are Christians. And although both Rwandans and Westerners have a certain idea about physical features, Tutsi tall and slender, Hutu short and broad, this appearance poorly distinguishes them, or distinguishes them. Indeed, one of the horrifying features of the genocide was that militias, unable to tell a Tutsi when they saw one, demanded that people produce identification cards that listed their ethnic group, and then killed people who were labeled Tutsi or refused to produce a card. In the years before the mass killings, a shadowy organization of elite Hutu connected to the government leaders had systematically organized a propaganda campaign, especially over the radio, against Tutsi. Apparently, many Hutu had still to be convinced that there was a Tutsi conspiracy against them, and social pressure had to be very carefully organized, village by village, to bring people into line. The source of hatred in Rwanda had a lot of work to do. Thousands of Hutu did not accede to this pressure, and when the genocide began, Hutu judged to be overly sympathetic to Tutsi were themselves frequently killed. Historians have carefully analyzed the layers of historical complexity leading up to the events of 1994. To most foreign journalists and observers, things look simple. A tribal bloodbath, old hatreds coming to the surface. But things have been more complicated. A history of interaction as much as of distinction, shaped, among other things, by colonizers' vision of African social and political organization and of so-called racial distinctions, by colonial education politics, very much favoring one group, and by post-colonial conflicts. And a murderous trajectory that was less a burst of ethnic enmity than a genocide organized by a ruling group anxious about its ability to stay in power and willing to define itself and its supporters against an ethnic other. However, there's an ongoing discrepancy in many parts of Africa between, on the one hand, the insight of academic research that pre-colonial Africa did not consist of clearly demarcated tribes, and on the other hand, the widespread assumption that current ethnic groups have a long, straightforward history going back to times immemorial. And even in this conflict, analysts very often were kind of classified as Hutu or Tutsi, depending on what kind of take or what kind of analysis they took in the debate. So while many observers very much emphasize the overall importance of ethnic identities in Africa, and at the same time kind of underline that there are weak nations and that there's a lack of national identities, recent research has shown otherwise, at least in some parts of the continent. And one of the starting points for this kind of research were the celebrations of 50 years of independence. So most of African states became independent nation states around 1960. So in 2010, there was also the time to reflect about what has happened. And those who have done intensive research on that came to the conclusion that most African countries became quite normal nations. As in many European nation states, for instance, patriotism and engagement are in conflict with political apathy, critique, and doubts about the unity of the nation. The process of nation building in Africa after World War II did not differ, according to these voices, fundamentally from developments in Europe a century earlier. And also in Europe, nations did not exist before nation states came into being, but were very often a product of these states. So one could say that African nations are younger, but hardly more artificial than European nations. And some of the ambiguities of national identity can be discussed as the example of Ghana, the first country that became independent in Africa in 1957. And I stop there. One of the basic ambiguities inherent in the Ghanaian project of nationhood is the unresolved tension between two fundamentally different concepts of national belonging. On the one hand, Ghana is legally constituted as a modern nation state with equal rights for all citizens, regardless of ethnic, religious, or regional background. On the other hand, Ghana inherited a colonial model of the nation as a federation of native states, or so-called native states, that is of descent-based communities centered on the authority of so-called traditional chiefs. And in this model of multi-ethnic nationalism, the state is expected to function as arbiter by ensuring that national resources are evenly distributed between culturally distinct groups and by providing a level playing field for the political representation. And some supporters of this model would insist that ethnic belonging should play an active role in the political process. A majority, however, would restrict it to more or less depoliticized displays of cultural identity and linguistic difference. But in any case, one abstract, but in any case, they would all insist that one cannot be a Ghanaian unless one is at the same time an Ashanti, a Dagomba, an Ewe, and so on. So in Ghana's political reality, and here we have Kwame Nkrumah, the first president and father of the nation, and here we have a kind of expression of some, if you like, cultural identity of one specific group in Ghana. And in Ghana's political reality, these two ideal typical models intermingle in proportions that depend on the occasion and the particular interest at stake. There seems to be a minimalist consensus that the nation's future should be defined by some degree of social inclusion, defining Ghana as a social justice community, by cultural diversity and by multi-party democracy. And at the very least, Ghanaians agree that disagreements on these issues and on the rules of debate should be resolved or tolerated without recourse to violence. Unity in diversity, with regard to both politics and ethnic regional diversity, is more than just a slogan. It is a widely shared conviction, as is the idea that cultural and regional heterogeneity should be generally depoliticized. And rather than merely divisive, controversies may well strengthen national consciousness and indirectly deepen a sense of commonality. And with these rather good news, I stop. Thank you very much.